Okay, here I am on the Great Alouette Lake in Golden Ears Park, and this is a man-made lake built in about 1920 after they clear-cut this whole forested area. Used to be the Alouette River flowing through here. Now it's dammed up and turned into a lake. So I figure today's about time to talk about Ignaz Semmelweis. Unusual name, which I can relate to as my name's kind of unusual as well, but Ignaz, I-G-N-A-Z, Ignaz, and then Semmelweis, Semmelweiss, something like that. But anyway, he was from Budapest, Hungary, so I can also relate to that. I'm not from Hungary, but some of my ancestors and my name is from Hungary. And so that begins our story. And Ignaz Semmelweis became a physician. He was a doctor physician in Europe, and he became quite high up. He was doing obstetrical surgery and delivering babies, and found himself in charge of several hospitals. And he was in charge of all the deliveries, and noticed at that time there was this thing called puerperal sepsis, which is still present today, but it's neonatal and perinatal sepsis of usually the mother, but could involve the baby as well. But there's a very high maternal mortality rate due to this puerperal sepsis, and that was during and after the delivery. The woman became infected with bacteria encountered usually during the delivery, and there was a very high mortality rate, and somewhere could have been 50 to 60% at this time, and this was several hundred years ago. Anyway, at this time they didn't know about bacteria or viruses or the cause of infection. I believe they may have believed in earth, wind, fire, and water at that time as causing everything. Or maybe it was God who was doing it. But anyway, whatever it was, they knew nothing about bacteria. But anyway, Dr. Semmelweis was concerned about the high infection rate, and it was not just at his hospitals, but all over the known world at that time. And a lot of women were dying. Like I say, almost half of them would die of an infection after childbirth. So what he noticed was that if you wash your hands, you could decrease the infection rate. Now, he did a study on this because he actually ran several hospitals, the OB departments at several hospitals. And at one hospital, most of the deliveries were done by nurses, or they called them midwives. And another hospital, they were mostly done by physicians or doctors. And nobody washed their hands. In between patients, blood and guts, whatever was on their hands, went to the next patient. They just went from delivery to delivery without washing their hands. Maybe they wiped it on a cloth or something like that, but definitely did not wash the bacteria away. So anyway, Dr. Semmelweis set up an experiment, and although it wasn't your classic placebo-controlled, double-blind experimental study that people in the health departments, etc., like these days, especially in COVID-19. But he set it up as best he could. So he had one hospital where the nurses worked. He probably because they were nurses, he was able to convince them to wash their hands in between cases. So he set that up at one hospital. The other hospital, I believe, was physicians who would have been more reluctant to wash their hands, more stubborn, etc. So he left that hospital the way it was, and they went on not washing their hands and going from patient to patient, and as we know now, carrying the infection from one patient to the next until all of the women were infected pretty well. Anyway, what he found out was that when the nurses washed their hands, their mortality rate, their perinatal mortality rate with infections and puerperal sepsis went down by approximately, I figure it was almost 900%. So at the end of the study, there were hardly any women having infections and dying of puerperal sepsis, which was amazing for the time. And he wrote this up as a research paper in medical literature, tried to publish it. As far as I remember, they were reluctant to publish it in the big journals, and maybe he got it published in the smaller journals, or a smaller journal that just would take anything, I believe. But anyway, the big journals wouldn't publish it. They poo-pooed it. They said, what is this guy, nuts, for suggesting that physicians should wash their hands and control physicians, and that they were spreading infection and being the cause of these women's demise. So anyway, the big people rejected it, big journals rejected it. I believe, I don't remember exactly, but he may have been published in somewhere smaller. So anyways, he got a bit of a name for himself, and then he started having his other hospitals do the hand washing, and they did very well. The puerperal sepsis went down a huge amount, and perinatal mortality in the mother became quite rare at the time in his hospitals. Anyway, but people were against him, and he was ostracized, he was ridiculed, he was called crazy, nuts, insane. People didn't want to follow his advice, they didn't believe it, they couldn't replicate it anywhere else at the time. And again, it wasn't followed in the big journals, and so the big shots weren't proposing to use this technique that Ignaz Semmelweis was proposing. So basically, he was ostracized. They wouldn't let him speak at the major conventions. He tried to. I believe he went to some of the major cities for major medical conventions trying to speak, and was, if he did speak, he was ridiculed, ostracized, laughed at, made fun of, and basically shunned. And he ended up going back home, and again, people were laughing at him, making fun of him, and starting to call him crazy, insane, loony, a lunatic, nuts, psycho, etc. So that started to make him mad, obviously, as it would when he knows he's right, but he's being ridiculed for allegedly being wrong when he isn't. So you can imagine what happened. He probably, some of the big shot doctors didn't want to wash their hands or didn't believe in his theory of germs or something causing infection other than earth, wind, fire, and water. And so eventually there was pressure put on the hospital administrators, let's say. He was called into the boardroom at his hospitals, and they basically threatened him, stop talking about this craziness, or we're going to have to lay you off and fire you. Obviously, he was right. He knew he was right, so he didn't stop talking about this. And eventually, with pressure put on the administrators, he ended up being fired. That obviously made him mad, and I can imagine this scenario. He goes in, starts arguing with the chief of staff, with the medical board on the such and such a hospital, and they start calling him a nuts, an idiot, and go home. And anyway, so he ends up slugging a few of them maybe, and that makes him look even more nuts. So he ends up getting arrested, and while being arrested, he's beaten up because he's a nut job. He's crazy. He's a lunatic. So guess what? They throw this prominent doctor in the loony bin, the insane asylum. They lock him up and throw away the key. Then the harder he fights, the more they do to him. So his family tries to get him out. Maybe he's got a few friends. The nurses try to release him because they saw the results of their washing their hands, etc. So he had some support, but most of the doctors, the big shots of the time, rejected his research and ostracized him, and did not want to follow this new theory, and probably most important, didn't want to be blamed for all of the previous deaths that they had obviously caused by not washing their hands and having thousands upon thousands of women die of sepsis needlessly. So they would not accept that, probably until the next generation came along and knew better than that. But poor Dr. Semmelweis, he ends up in the loony bin, the insane asylum, locked up, and still talking about his hand washing. And all it was, a simple hand washing. Just wash your hands between patients, and it's just a simple procedure, no big deal, but was unaccepted. Nobody would accept it, and but he kept going on with it, and it probably made him mad. He was upset. He would argue with people in the insane asylum. Obviously, some of them are insane, so they would get upset with him and then beat him up, and he endured a lot of trauma while he was in there, and eventually he was beaten up one day, and it was very serious. He didn't get the proper treatment. He was locked up in an insane asylum, and whoever was treating him, I'm not even sure if it was a physician, it might have been other patients in there, but obviously they did not wash their hands either, and he ended up dying of the trauma, complicated, I believe, by infection as well. So that's the story of poor Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. Again, I can empathize with it. First, he was from Hungary. His name was very difficult. And third, he was coming up with a new revolutionary idea that nobody else would go along with. And he was ridiculed and called insane and called all sorts of names, and then had the ultimate thrown away as a lunatic and beat up and killed. Okay, anyway, because of that, we have what's called Semmelweis Syndrome. So that is someone who brings up a new idea. They may be ridiculed at the time, then ostracized, and then demoted, beat up, whatever. But it ends up being a bad thing to come up with something revolutionary because the other big shots do not accept it and do not want to accept it because, for one thing, it makes them look bad that they have been possibly hurting and killing people by not following these procedures all along. So that's the reason they don't want to accept it personally. Secondly, new things are hard to swallow, and the physicians, don't want to learn new procedures, new things, because that takes an effort. So anyway, that's called Semmelweis syndrome, and believe it or not, still occurs to these days. And I can empathize with that. I tried to do mold and toxicology, and even though I thought I was right and helped tens if not hundreds of thousands of people with it, got people out of their moldy homes, they improved, treated them for mold, they improved, wrote articles on it, etc. But there were those who refused to accept it, and they ostracized me, ridiculed me. I'm still on the internet as, I'm called names and, a fraud and corrupt and, articles written about me that are, totally bogus. Anyway, that is what is called Semmelweis syndrome, still occurring today. And I guess it's probably part of the reason I'm sitting here right here today talking about this. Mold, when I was dealing with it, and many of the other toxins too, were not accepted. For one reason, the big industry depended on the toxins, so they were using them. Just pesticides, for example. Chemical companies make huge fortunes off of pesticides, but that does not mean that they are safe and they can injure people. So part of my job was to diagnose and treat and do testing and do treatment on these patients, but some of them ended up in lawsuits, and the lawyers and the defense companies did not like that, so they would ostracize the person, the experts who were promoting the treatment for the patients. And because of that, they came after me and committed Semmelweis syndrome. Okay, so hopefully that explains a little bit about the poor trials and tribulations of Ignaz. And I hope, Ignaz, I'm saying your name correctly. Unfortunately, he did pass away several hundred years ago. He was beaten up and left for dead inside an insane asylum, and never did get to see the results of his studies for simple hand washing, saving, probably as of this date, millions, if not billions, of lives. All right. And not just humans, but, veterinary treatment, animals, etc. So he did a tremendous good for mankind and for the earth, was ridiculed, thrown away because of it, and killed because of it, which has taken place many times in history. So anyway, but my point is it's still occurring today. So please try not to ridicule and ostracize people who are promoting new things, especially if they make sense and especially if they have a good outcome. Okay, Semmelweis syndrome, Ignaz Semmelweis. Try and remember that name, very important person, very important results, and such a simple thing, washing your hands in between cases. Very simple. Very simple. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good day and have a good life.